Can you hear me now?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. Um, can you see it?
A little bit.
Okay. Yeah. We're seeing you a little blurred, but
Yeah,
okay.
you're blurred as well. I mean, I record this on my side, so I can send you whatever I record.
Okay. We're recording too, but if you could record, it's okay. It's better, even better.
Okay, great.
Um, uh, so, uh, well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Epstein, for granting us this interview. My name is João, and this is my colleague Miguel. We're going to ask you some questions, and my colleague is going to start making the first one.
So, Mr. Epstein, thank you very much for granting this interview. And our first question would be, what is the moral case for fossil fuels?
Well, the moral case for fossil fuels overall is the idea that humanity is morally obligated to use more fossil fuels, not less. But the key to understanding why that's the obligation, why that's the morality, is that we should be measuring the right decision, not by the idea of being green, by minimizing our impact on the planet, which is the prevailing morality by which we judge energy, but we should be judging it by maximizing human flourishing. So that means we want the course of action that will most advance human beings' lives, and that, it turns out, is to use more fossil fuels, not less.
So the next question would be, why do you think in your view that, or if you think that in your view people, or most people are commonly mistaken about what is the role of fossil fuels in their lives?
Well, I think the number one mistake is that people aren't clear on how they're measuring whether fossil fuels are good, what their standard of evaluating any form of energy is. And so what that means is if your standard is we want to minimize our impact on nature, what you're going to do is you're going to tend to assume that things that impact nature a lot, like fossil fuels, are bad. And you're going to tend to only look at negative things, not positive things. And thus people have very little interest in, say, the unique attributes of petroleum for modern materials, or the unique attributes of petroleum for air travel, or the unique benefits of petroleum for agriculture, because they just have this idea, well, oh, oil is industrial, it's dirty, we should be doing something natural, like solar and wind, whatever natural means. And so there's just this, we have this pre-existing bias toward any kind of new, any sort of substantial industrialization or transformation of nature. And you can see this, that we have the same thing with nuclear power. People assume that nuclear power must be unsafe, even though empirically it's the safest form of energy ever.
So it is safe to say that the most advanced part of the world suffers from some kind of Dickens syndrome. Oliver Twist syndrome. We see industrialization as a dirty, and by contrast, what you argue is that more fossil fuels are the cleanest form of energy considered overall.
Well, they're the best form of energy considered overall. Cleanliness is not an end in itself. Cleanliness is a means to human flourishing. Cleanliness usually, it can refer to two things. One is legitimate, one is illegitimate. So the legitimate thing is the absence or lack of harmful byproducts. So in that sense, you want something to be clean. You want to have minimal risks and byproducts. But clean is often lumped together with green, which means impacting nature. And to impact nature is not a bad thing. it's usually a good thing because human beings survive by impacting nature. So anyway, what we want is we want the form of energy that's best for human beings, all things considered. So you would think, say, in the realm of disease prevention. Let's say you have a vaccine that has a minor side effect, but that actually prevents polio, versus you have a holistic remedy that doesn't have any side effects, but also doesn't prevent polio. Which one do you want? You want the one that's best. Well, in a sense, the holistic one is cleanest, but it's not any good. So there's even a question of whether solar and wind are cleanest. I think nuclear is the cleanest ultimately, but it's not the right metric to use. It's in the case of the legitimate aspect of clean, it's part of the picture, but it's definitely not the whole picture.
So, is climate change a real concern for human beings, or is it a concern of the rich countries, or the rich people of the rich countries?
One flaw of this whole debate is just sloppiness of terminology. So it's very unclear what people mean by climate change. What we would be concerned about if it were a phenomenon would be a man-made climate catastrophe arising from an increase in CO2 levels due to our CO2 emissions. So if the real question is, increased CO2 levels a problem? And I think a problem on the order that would justify restricting our most affordable source of energy. And I think the answer to that is no. They seem to have some impact, although it's hard to even directly attribute causation. But we know that they warm in a lab, so you'd expect some impact on the atmosphere. But just the amount of warming that they generate theoretically and in practice is just minor. And in general, people want warming. So people only think that warming is bad because they think that humans caused it, and they think that humans impacting nature is bad, which goes back to the issue of how we're measuring good and bad. Now, your point about the poor countries is a good point. And what that goes to is that the poor countries actually have to think seriously about what they need for survival, let alone flourishing. So if somebody says, oh, your biggest problem is that the weather is 10% worse, that is incomprehensible to them because their problem, even with the weather, is just the natural weather is super dangerous. So it's not that they need it to be 102 degrees, not 104 degrees. They need air conditioning. And it's not that they need it to be 0 degrees, not 2 degrees. They need warmth. And of course, they need to produce food. So the idea that in the name of bad weather, we're going to tear down our civilization and prevent others from building one up using the amazing tool of fossil fuels, that's a really immoral thing.
So, and what would be your explanation for why is it so difficult for the moral message to pass? The poor countries would need more fossil fuels and not less. That's moral. And why is it so difficult to convince the world that communism is true?
Well, the idea of the moral case for fossil fuels has only been nationally known in the U.S. for 2.5 years. The book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, that I wrote, came out in November 2014. So it's still pretty early. And I think it's important that it's a distinctive book in a couple of ways. But the main way is that it's explicitly saying we need to change the standard by which we judge the moral course of action. And without being explicit about that, we're going to default to the green idea of minimizing our impact. And that's always going to be against any effective industrializations. I think the core of it is to change how we're measuring good and bad, to publicize that. I think that leads to all sorts of other beneficial consequences because we can all be on the same page. We can say, okay, well, if we're talking about climate, how are we measuring climate? Well, we're not measuring it just, are we changing things? We're measuring it by, is this significant in the context of human flourishing? But today, because we measure everything by, are we changing nature? Are we impacting nature? Then we treat very small changes of nature as if they're a huge deal because we think it's just wrong. And then that even filters to science, because then people say, oh, you're denying science if you support fossil fuels, because isn't it true that we're changing things? But the point is, the moral truth is not we shouldn't change anything. Fossil fuels are not bad if they change things. They're bad if they change things for the worse for human beings. So the whole thing is on the wrong standard, and I think that's really the key. And, if anyone goes to our website, industrialprogress.com, and you read our different resources, you'll see everything is around this idea of the standard of good and bad as human flourishing.
The next question, it's not really a question, we just like you to, if you could please briefly explain us the difference between two concepts associated with your work, the humanist and the non-humanist. If you could briefly extend a little bit on those two concepts, please.
Sure. This is very tied to the issue of the standard of evaluation. So the humanist in this context is the person who holds human flourishing as his standard. So when he looks at any situation, particularly involving the relationship between man and nature, he's interested in human well-being. So the humanist is not indifferent to the rest of nature. He cares about the rest of nature precisely because it's so important to human beings. So, for example, if there was some major negative shift in some ecosystem, negative for human beings, he would be concerned about that, and therefore he wants to understand those kinds of things. But if there's just a shift that we cause and a certain breed of mosquito or sloth or squirrel is compromised, well, that could either be good or it's not significant compared to the benefits. Now, the non-humanist or the anti-humanist is saying, well, I measure good and bad not by human well-being, not by human flourishing, but by something else. Now, what is that something else? Today, it's usually the rest of nature. So what the non-humanist is saying, and things are good as long as they don't benefit human beings. So, because it's not like, oh, they prefer polar bears over mosquitoes or something. They're just saying, oh, the rest of nature, as long as it's not human, it's good. And I think that's a really perverse idea, but that's the whole idea of being green, because being green says, hey, let's protect the environment. Protect it from what? Protect it from us. So that means that our goal is just that we suffer. As long as we suffer, as long as we don't act, then we're doing the right thing. So it's a very deeply, ultimately to be a non-humanist is to be an anti-human.
So the next question is something that you probably have heard a lot of times, but it comes a lot in terms of pro climate or against climate change debates, which is the myth, if you believe it's a myth or not, of the 97% consensus that 97% of all climate change scientists say that climate change is real and it happens because of human action. What would your answer on the 97% consensus?
I think if you get an argument like this, your answer should be just two questions, which is, what exactly did the 97% prove, and how did they prove it? And it's important to ask for proof, because a percentage agreement, let alone a report on a percentage agreement, more than 97% of people who spout that statistic have never looked into the source of it, which it turns is completely corrupt. But if you just tell me, hey, X climate scientists agree on Y, okay, well, if they agree, then they can tell me why they agree, and they can certainly tell me what they agree on. Because what people want you to think, what the Greens want you to think, is that 97% of climate scientists agree that fossil fuels are evil because they're causing a climate catastrophe. That's what that's so bad that we have to dramatically reduce energy. Because that's the agenda of the Greens. They want to dismantle industrial civilization via fossil fuels. So they want you to think, oh, 97% agree with climate catastrophe. But that's not even remotely true. It's that the 97%, insofar as that stat is legitimate, agree that there's some warming impact. But some warming impact has nothing to do with climate catastrophe. So it's a very dishonest kind of position. That's why if you ask, hey, what do they agree on and how do they prove it, you get rid of it pretty quickly, because it turns out, oh, they agree that we're having some warming impact? Great. Okay, well, that certainly doesn't justify restricting energy for billions of people. And also, if you ask how they prove it, a lot of them could be wrong, and I think they generally are wrong in terms of their assessment of the magnitude of the warming, and I think for fairly straightforward reasons. I mean, the whole field, the modern field, was founded based on the premise that CO2 was causing problems, and that's the reason why it's a multi-billion-dollar field. So without any kind of conspiracy, just if you pay people to find out bad things about CO2, that's what you're going to get. And the people who suspect otherwise aren't going to get funding. And ultimately you get a little clique of people, or it's a pretty big clique now, all whose whole, not just their livelihood, but their whole reputation is based on pretty significant claims about warming. Not as catastrophic as people think, but still I think more than the evidence justifies. So again, what did they prove? How did they prove it? Is a really straightforward and effective response.
So I have a follow-up question on that. How do you say that, if it's possible to say, how do you say that the research on what is climate change and what is climate science stands now about these issues? If you say that, if you still think that maybe not a 97% consensus exists, but is already, does some consensus exist already, or it's too hard to say, or because what our idea is that a lot of these issues may be a little bit, maybe they're not telling the right story in terms of what the media tells and what the other sorts of media tell. What would be then the state of the climate science and their conclusions about this issue, if you can say something about it?
It's really hard. It's really hard to generalize, and often in different fields there aren't consensuses, and particularly that's true if the field is an immature field of inquiry, which climate science definitely is, insofar at least as it deals with predicting. So there's just not an ability to understand climate in a systematic way that allows prediction. So the real consensus of the field should be, we actually have very little to offer in terms of telling you what's going to happen. We can tell you what happens with greenhouse gases in isolation, which is very mild, and we can keep you apprised of different kinds of measurements so that you can see trends and correlations over time. But we simply don't have the ability to predict the future. Now, that is not a stance that gets you funding, because in part, then people can say, well, why do we need you? Right? Why should we be giving you funding? Well, the reason to give them funding today, certainly not that they're coming up with some great weather prediction system, which would be great. They certainly can't predict the weather very well. So what are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're furthering people's agendas. So that's their main value, which is and because it's government, they have a monopoly, so it's very hard to break. So I wouldn't think of it in terms of consensus. I'd think in terms of what do they say they've proved, and how have they proved it? And it turns out the most honest ones acknowledge they can't predict too much. And if people are interested in more on this, search my name, Alex Epstein, and then Power Hour. That's my podcast, and we've had a lot of really interesting climate scientists on, and you can hear how they think of the issue.
And our final question, it's not actually a question, but we would like to hear you on if you have, to our Portuguese political science students, because your views are very minoritary here in Europe, and what would be your message to Europeans in general, but through Portuguese students of political science? What would you say to us all?
I'd say something that I say to everyone, but I think it's particularly relevant to Europeans, which is we have to take seriously the fact that most majorities in history are wrong about most things. And when we look in the past, certainly when we look in the past of the conduct of certain nations in Europe, namely Germany and Russia, we can see, and particularly Germany is interesting because Germany was the most intellectually prestigious country in the world in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century. And of course, it became the most barbaric and evil country in the world in the 1940s, right? And, with Russia right along with it. And it's, these were real people like us who made these decisions, who signed off on things, who endorsed them. In the U.S., you had significant endorsement of Nazis, mass endorsement of communists. And these people murdered, millions and millions and millions of people. That can seem like an extreme example, but you can also take slavery in the past. We look at a lot of things in the past and we say, hey, those majorities were wrong. But those people are not genetically different than we are. Those people had all the same kinds of capacities for mistakes and for evasions and for dishonesty. And thus, I take that very seriously in my own thinking, and I try to think with myself and with others, are we really thinking about this in a way that the future will look well upon? And the fact that we become popular in our existing society is absolutely not a good reason for doing something or even thinking that it's true. So you can't take comfort in the fact that a lot of other people agree with things unless they can really prove it to your satisfaction. So one way to fight against that is to read alternative views from people who seem interesting. So if any of my views seem interesting, I'd say check out The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. You can check out the whole book, or if we have a bunch of resources that are free that we're happy to email you. Go to moralcaseforfossilfuels.com, read the first chapter, even read the first 3 pages, and see what you think. And I think you should take it seriously, because you really don't want to be devoting your life and your efforts to something that's harming people. And it's very, very easy to do so. And it's very, very easy to do so even if you're in the majority. So if you think of things that way, I think you'll end up at better answers. You'll end up doing more good.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein, for the privilege of granting us this interview. It was very interesting, and it's always important to have a not so mainstream point of view, but definitely interesting point of view about a topic that is so hot right now. It's so on the media and always being regulated in a way that totally contradicts or totally goes against what you defend. But it's always interesting to be able to share with our colleagues a less mainstream point of view.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry.
All right. Thank you.